The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. We're extremely lucky as writers that we can have mentors wherever we can just reach for the words. So Abraham Lincoln is one of my mentors. What would Abe do? It's a question worth asking often. The honored dead I'm going to go to next is the poet Philip Levine, who was my mentor in that first year of the Mentor Series more than 30 years ago, and died this last year. I'm going to read his poem, They Feed, They Lion, which is unlike anything else he ever wrote. And I'm going to go ahead and post it on Facebook tomorrow with a little bit of the interview in which he explains where it came from. Philip was working in Detroit in one of the many tough jobs that he worked in with a couple of Jamaican guys. And they were in a garage sorting through, taking apart old engines and sorting through pieces. They were going to have to do it properly because they were going to have to put together new engines from what they had sorted out. And one of the guys picked up a gunny sack, one of those burlap bags that they were using for sorting, and he said, it said the Detroit Zoo, and he said, they feed they lion out of they bag. And Levine heard that and went, oh, they feed they lion. So this poem came out of that. And one thing that is important to know too is that coming up from Detroit, lots and lots of people came up from Detroit in its heyday to find work, including lots of people from the Appalachian Mountains. And he mentions that in here. West Virginia, and a town that was called Kiss My Ass. And so that's when you hear Kiss My Ass, it's in capitals, it's a place. They feed they lion. Out of burlap sacks, out of bearing butter, out of black bean and wet slate bread, out of the acids of rage, the candor of tar, out of creosote, gasoline, drive shafts, wooden dollies, they lie and grow. Out of the gray hills of industrial barns, out of rain, out of bus ride, West Virginia to kiss my ass, out of buried aunties, mothers hardening like pounded stumps, out of the bones need to sharpen and the muscles to stretch, they lie and grow. Earth is eating trees, fence posts, gutted cars. Earth is calling in her little ones, come home, come home. From pig balls, from the ferocity of pig driven to holiness, from the furred ear and the full jowl come the repose of the belly, from the purpose they lie and grow. From the sweet glues of the trotters come the sweet kinks of the fist. From the full flower of the hams, the thorax of caves. From bow down, come rise up, come they lion. From the reeds of shovels, the grained arm that pulls the hands, they lie and grow. From my 5 arms and all my hands, from all my white sins forgiven, they feed. From my car passing under the stars, they lion. From my children inherit. From the oak turned to a wall, they lion. From they sack and they belly opened, and all that was hidden burning on the oil-stained earth, they feed they lion, and he comes. Philip was really great, and he was a wonderful mentor. The New York Times Sunday magazine, for the first of the year, published a little remembrance of him because he died this last year. And I will put that on Facebook too, so you can check him out. I'm next going to read to you a little part of that new bluegrass choral music piece that's called Mortals and Angels. That we just premiered at Carnegie Hall. And in this piece, the piece was built around a children's choir. The situation is that a bluegrass band has gone to a fishing camp for vacation, and the parents and the grandparents and the adults are very involved in making music and in praying. But the kids would just rather fish. And it turns out that a bunch of angels also turn up for this particular vacation, and the kids get really sick of the conversation with the angels. So finally, there's lots of theological argument. They finally say, we're going fishing, and you can't come. So the adults say, well, we're coming, which is what always happens. And so then the kids sing their song, but because the kids said you can't come, then the adults can't interfere with what the kids are singing. And the kids are singing about their great fear, their reasonable fear about growing up into an environmental dystopia. And because they are kids, everything just sort of goes overblown. So we have a couple of people who serve as narrators, one for the mortals, I'll put down there, and one for the angels. So I'm going to read you this tiny lyric that's shorter than this explanation I've just given you. And then I'll do a little bit of the narration that follows it. Bad days are coming is the kids' song. We know bad days are coming, are coming. Bad days are coming, are coming. The shores start to crumble and the glaciers all shrink. The rivers dry up and there's nothing to drink. We know bad days are coming, are coming. And the air is all ashes, and soon nothing will thrive, and the cities are burning, and zombies arrive. We know bad days are coming, are coming. Wait a minute. You don't believe in angels, but you do believe in zombies? That's right. But zombies aren't real. Wishful thinking. I'm going to read this last piece, and it looks like I have a lot of pages here, but I have to tell you, because I don't trust my glasses, I have it printed in really big type. So I'm not going to read that long. This is from a novel called The Comforts of Home, a novel manuscript that's completed and is making the rounds. And the novel takes place over 2 weeks. Eve Bracewell, whose meditation we won't go into in this passage I'm going to read, is the daughter of the man who's dying. He's in his 80s. He's lived a very full life, and he's ready to die. So the fact that he's dying is tough for the living, as it always is, but not necessarily a bad thing. One of the ways that I, as a writer, sort of stand at variance with certainly parts of the publishing world is that I don't think of death as a bad thing. It's just so much part of life, so I don't shy away from it whatsoever. And because this man who's dying is a coroner, he knows a lot about it. Imagine if your father was a coroner and you loved him and admired him very much and even fancied that you were maybe his favorite, and he offered to let you go out with him on night calls. That's where we're going. But first I need to reference another of my mentors, Robert Louis Stevenson, who died in his 40s. And it's hard to imagine that someone Robert Louis Stevenson could have been so ill for most of his life, but he really was. And he also died with a glad heart. And I'm just going to read his requiem for himself. You'll recognize this. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with the will. This be the verse you engrave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home as the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter home from the hill. So now we're going into a section that I call Night Calls, with Owen Bracewell comatose in his deathbed, and his grown daughter, sitting nearby. The year Eve was 12, her father began allowing her to go with him on night calls in the summers or on weekends, whenever the weather was calm and if she happened to be awake. Such a privilege. So she arranged to be awake, trained herself to sleep lightly and to slide out of bed at the jangle of the phone, especially on Saturdays, nights of high alcohol, high incident, and high accident, when she made sure to lay out her underwear, shirt, and dungarees on a chair beside the bed in the order in which she would put them on, so she could dress with her eyes still shut and pad down the hallway with her shoes in her hands to avoid waking anyone else. Then they'd be speeding along through the dark, with his instruments and supplies packed just so in the trunk, towards some scene of chaos and horror, or maybe of stillness and dismay. And she'd watch him sidelong as he drove, readying himself, muttering under his breath. Then he'd remember that she was in the car with him and go from muttering to thinking out loud, explaining himself to her, describing how a word well placed and a touch well timed could ease the grimmest circumstance and make of a death a fact of nature, something natural with an onward flow. However, if a coroner's call was unexpected, if it concerned teenagers behind the wheel, or parents of young children, or worst of all, the death of a child, he said nothing about nature, but cursed as he drove, "Damn, God damn it." And Eve came wide awake beside him in the car, glorying in his vehemence. He too sometimes felt useless. In the face of death, everyone feels like a clown, he told her more than once. But she could scarcely believe that he ever really felt that way when he was so obviously of use, draping his hands, which were loose, then no hint of the wizened claws they would become. Not large hands, but nimble and strong, briefly, casually over someone else's hands, someone at the scene who was starting their mourning. And then from the supply of handkerchiefs he kept in several pockets, he would pass them one, a large pressed monogrammed handkerchief that they were to keep, no laundering and returning it to him, he told them, and then he would move on to the body and the facts of the case. Few of his handkerchiefs were returned. Many were in evidence at funerals, showing O.A.B., Owen Allen Bracewell, embroidered in initials on the corner. He claimed he sent handkerchiefs in his place to funerals. He hated funerals, especially the open casket kind, and wouldn't attend unless he knew the deceased. But then, of course, he knew everyone. Even so, in the uproar at a death scene at night, people sometimes confused him with the mortician. To anyone who made that mistake, he reminded them that he was only there to ascertain cause and manner of death and to sign the certificate for the county. He wasn't selling anything. For the mortician's so-called art, the withering eyes packed with cotton and capped with plastic bubbles, then the eyelids shimmied down to cover the fraud, the jaw fixed, the mouth stitched shut, going in and out through a nostril with a curved needle, an upholsterer's needle. Did Eve know that? He had nothing but contempt. This was sometimes the talk on the ride home. To the putty slipped in and the fluid injected to plump the tissues, the false blush and the hairstyle improved upon from the way the hair was worn in life. The straight-haired woman buried a curly head. The fellow laid in his grave with his hair parted on the wrong side. Dr. Bracewell said, "God damn it to hell." And don't get him started on caskets. Christ on a crutch. The grieving family bilked thousands for some shiny capsule lined with shirred satin that once buried would fall to pieces as soon as the water table rose, mahogany being just as bad as pine underground. Or that tripe about preservation, the goddamn friggin' gaskets they sold people, so-called hermetic seals, which if they held merely trapped methane that would build up as the corpse decomposed, explosions in the graveyard, or would guarantee mold within the seal, great growths of mold, the corpse bearded, wigged, and furred in mold over jellied bones, as he knew from internments he attended. Who knew better? Probably he confessed the goddamning to his rector, but Eve thrilled to his hard words when she was a doubter at 12, a scoffer at 13, and at 14, a silent cynic. In the years when she found it far more trying to go to church with her father than to be out all night on a coroner's call. Sometimes on a night call, however, she came upon kids she knew, and that was a problem. The other kids wouldn't want her there when they'd have to encounter her later at school, after she'd seen how they looked, crying or shivering or speechless over something really stupid or so sad they couldn't even grasp it yet, standing around in the yard in their PJs or underwear, their mothers with hair falling out of curlers. They didn't want Eve there snooping. They couldn't see that she was helping her father. At such times, she couldn't see that either, and she'd slip back to the car and hunker down out of sight, napping on the back seat until Dr. Bracewell was ready to go. But then came the call on an October night to her boyfriend's farmhouse. She was 15, the boy was 17, Jerome. Her family knew nothing of Jerome. He wasn't the sort her father would approve, not a boy with college in his future. In a matter of months, he'd be leaving school for full-time farming. But he was funny and sexy and sad. And though his breath tasted of the cigarettes Dr. Bracewell so abhorred, Eve, with Glee Club practice as her alibi, let him drive her to the river in his aunt's car after school, where he played Bob Dylan to her on his guitar and got her to sing with him and made out with her. He was careful with her, the coroner's daughter. He kissed her hard but kept his hands to himself, and he dropped her off a block away from her house exactly 20 minutes after Glee Club let out, the 20 minutes it would have taken for her to walk home from school. His aunt turned out to be the problem, the cause of the night call, a gloomy person, upset by noise. He had 3 rowdy brothers. The house was full of guys. It was a farm. The roosters were going to crow. The aunt lived in the attic. They'd crammed egg cartons beneath the attic flooring for her as soundproofing, but she'd hanged herself up there anyway, wrote a note, looped a belt on a hook, and kicked the chair out from under her, leaving Jerome to find her when he poked his head up the stairwell to say goodnight and ask if he could borrow her car the next day. When Eve and her father arrived on the call, she recognized the name on the mailbox. She'd never been out there. Jerome had kept her a secret from his family, too, the serious girl he'd taken up with, the girl from the prominent family. Here he came, bolting from the house, shirtless and barefoot in his jeans, white-faced and done with talking to police, making straight for Eve as though she would save him. And of course she would. While Dr. Bracewell stared dumbfounded, she took Jerome by the hand, saying firmly that Jerome was a friend and that she'd find her own way home. And then she walked away from her father toward the greater adventure of the night. Jerome took her to his hiding place in the barn, an empty milking stall he curtained off with a tarpaulin and padded with an old quilt, folded many times over, every fold leaking stuffing. The stall smelled pleasantly of rotten apple cores he'd left scattered around. Death and darkness dropped them into a heavy trance. She lay down with him there. His voice was unsteady, so she didn't make him talk. His hands for the first time were on her. He slipped the buttons through her shirt placket as surely as he would have undone his own shirt had he been wearing any. She would have given him anything then to save him, though of course she was taking too, getting something for herself that driving the county with her father on night calls could never have given her. She felt so self-possessed that night that she found herself unconcerned when Jerome discovered that she wore no bra. She was late blooming and had only an undershirt over her tiny breasts. As he pulled the undershirt over her head, his hands caught a moment in her hair, which was red gold then, and not yet the premature silver it would become, and then they were skin to skin. Dr. Bracewell's flashlight found them, however, before things got very far. They heard his tramping steps and saw the zigzagging beam of the flashlight, and she had just enough time to get her undershirt on and jam her hands through her shirt sleeves before he was there, so she didn't, after all, find her own way home. Her father was, for once, silent on the drive back, terrifyingly silent, but by the time they got home, he appeared to have forgotten that he'd ever seen her in the barn with her clothes undone. True to habit, he poured her a tiny cup of coffee, which she sipped while he finished his paperwork. After night calls, they rarely went back to bed at all. It was perhaps strange that he allowed her the coffee and the loss of sleep, given that she was a growing girl and that he was a doctor, and given how carefully he examined everything he did. In the months to come, he would see that she had no chance to spend any more time alone in the dark with her friend Jerome, to whom she would send ardent letters blaming her father. But Jerome wasn't much of a letter writer, and not anyone she really would have married, so maybe she'd had her father to thank that the thing with Jerome went no further. Or had she and her father been maybe a little too close? Oh, surely not. Surely one could never be too close to one's father. Thank you.